Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Joris van Hoboken. Welcome at this panel that is wonderfully titled From AI and Quantum to EuroStack and Digital Commons, Which Way to Digital Sovereignty? I'm joined by three wonderful speakers. We're still missing one speaker and hope that you will be able to join us in a moment. But in the interest of time, and since we all got up so early, we should start early too. So so the panel is basically the panel is about digital sovereignty, and so I think maybe to summarize, I would summarize the questions that we're asking is like, what is being imagined under the header of digital sovereignty? What should we be imagining under digital sovereignty? What does it involve also specifically, these different types of imaginations, and which challenges are thus being addressed? So we have four speakers, one of which is still absent, but hopefully coming. First, we will hear from Plixavra Voyotsolu. Plixavra is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Information Law, doing research in the Law and Governance of Research Group. And she holds a PhD from KU Leuven, from CTIP at KU Leuven, and is there also affiliate researcher. She works on digital regulation and policy and the impact of emerging technologies on rights, freedoms, and society. Our second speaker is Susanna Warsel. Susanna is the Director of Research at Open Future. She has 15 years of experience with human rights research and advocacy, and in her work she has focused on the intersection of science, technology, human rights, and ethics. Our third speaker, thank you so much for joining us.
I was downstairs in the big room. I didn't have indication. Sorry for that.
I'm so sorry, but we're very glad to have you. Alexandra Pol, she's a global policy lead at Pascal. And Pascal is a quantum computing company. In her role, she takes responsibility for Pascal's public affairs, standardization, and sustainability activities. Alexandra has 15 years of professional experience, including in the public sector, private sector, and academia. And then last but not least, Professor Thomas Strijns, who is a joint chair in law with interest in regulatory theory and regulatory institutions at the European University Institute in Florence, at the Law Department and the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. And his research agenda at the UI investigates the role of European law in the global regulatory governance of digital technologies, the relationship between data, tech, and infrastructure regulation, and the interface between the regulation through law with governance by other means, in particular infrastructure as regulation. So, what is being imagined under digital sovereignty? What should be imagined, and what does it entail? The floor is first to Plixavra.
Thank you very much, Joris, and thanks to everybody for being here. I'm very happy to be kicking off this conference with these great panels next to me, panelists. So during my talk, I would like to first briefly introduce how digital sovereignty has been evolving as an EU policy agenda, and then focus on two examples of technologies that the EU considers critical for digital sovereignty, that is AI and quantum technologies, to unpack a little bit more how this works in practice. So digital sovereignty is a central policy ambition for Europe, but also beyond. And since US President Donald Trump took office in 2025, it has become an urgency amidst tech and trade wars. So it's a concept that has evolved throughout the past about 15 years through different iterations of internet, data sovereignty, technological sovereignty. And now digital sovereignty has become a broad encompassing term, kind of an umbrella term, that is used to convey a broad array of policy imperatives. In the EU, according to policy documents, it refers to our ability to act independently in the digital world, and therefore constitutes a crucial means to safeguard our values. So the EU seeks to assert its digital sovereignty by investing domestically in resources and technologies it considers critical, such as AI and quantum, through funding schemes such as Horizon Europe. By pursuing partnerships with so-called like-minded countries like Japan, while blocking those deemed more threatening like China through trade agreements and export controls. And by promoting EU values and rules as the global norm through laws that have a somewhat extraterritorial reach, such as the GDPR and the AI Act. However, we can observe several inconsistencies within the EU's digital sovereignty narrative. As this traditional ideal of autonomy, independence, and control over domestic practices, digital sovereignty can be considered as rather unrealistic, as Europe is highly dependent on other countries, and particularly China and the US, for material and immaterial resources and services, from critical raw materials and chips to the cloud, and it's difficult to keep foreign control over data and countries at bay. And so while digital sovereignty is a means to an end, through these inconsistencies, it is sometimes difficult to tell what the end ultimately is. And I will explain what I mean through these two examples of AI and quantum. So digital sovereignty claims regarding AI have largely been about EU values and competition and innovation. To compete in the so-called AI race, Europe's bet is on developing and deploying trustworthy and human-centric AI, as well as promoting public and private investment in the EU's own AI models and the wide-scale industrial, business, and public sector integration of AI through funding schemes and regulations such as the AI Act, but also the Invest AI framework. Essentially, the ambition is to compete with US and Chinese hyperscalers. For example, the EU is funding 19 AI factories, and it has announced 6 AI gigafactories, and the latter will be co-financed and co-owned by the private sector. Access to and use of these supercomputing infrastructures will then also be co-controlled by private companies. With EUROS, we have also been investigating how quantum technologies have emerged as a rising star within EU's digital sovereignty discourse. They are presented by the EU as crucial, not only for security and economic development, but also for industrial competitiveness, global leadership, and societal well-being, and thus European values. So a widely expressed view in policy is that quantum technologies could define the winners of tomorrow, and sometimes are even presented as a backup plan to the AI race. For instance, the EuroStack and Draghi reports emphasize the wide range of opportunities stemming from quantum technologies. Yet, the trajectory of the development and deployment of these technologies remains highly unclear. We do not know how, when, and to what extent these promises can materialize. And while some applications, for example, quantum sensing technologies, are much closer to reality, for others, like quantum computing, we're still questioning how to build the hardware and what will the use cases be. And while in part it makes sense that Europe is betting on its scientific and engineering base and strength, the bet on quantum and even AI can also be considered as risky, even beyond the material dependencies I mentioned. These investments often assume that there will be a need for them in order for them to also become profitable and yield these benefits. But for instance, the Quantum Euro strategy explicitly acknowledges that industry and society will have to be convinced to adopt quantum technology applications. More fundamentally, digital sovereignty policy and regulation are used to render digital innovation indispensable for Europe and its values, but it might fall short when it comes to actually delivering the benefits as widely. So first, the language of values that is being used is often very broad and vague, and it risks being tokenized to just promote EU policies. One thing that can be asked is to what extent this tech race and ultimately a risky techno-solutionism reflects societal goals that can uphold European human rights and values, undefined as they may be. And for example, AI especially is linked to environmental harms, and even though quantum and AI are often presented as going to bring solutions to the climate crisis, there is little evidence that that will be the case. The strong presence of private actors in AI and quantum infrastructure can also raise questions of governance and accountability. And importantly, the innovation costs and benefits are likely to be borne and enjoyed unequally within the European Union. Member states and national companies that can actually afford to play a part in the EU digital sovereignty agenda in the long run are the biggest ones, like France and Germany, that already have big competitive tech market capacities. For instance, again, the Draghi report and the EuroStack reflect the strong presence of French and German companies. This means that likely a handful of companies, of European companies, can also attract most of the European funds, while companies from smaller countries like Southern and Eastern Europe will eventually be unable to compete as much. And this risks further deepening dependencies of many member states, as well as ultimately also opening up the door to big tech, which is very much ready to invest. And now we can also even see a shift away from values altogether, leaning increasingly into the language of innovation, competitiveness, and securitization. For instance, and I think we will hear very much about this during this conference, the European legislator recently agreed to amend the AI Act in order to assure innovation. This so-called simplification essentially relaxes rules that comprise minimum safeguards for fundamental rights. The reaction of Executive Vice President for Tech Sovereignty, Security and Democracy, Hanna Virkkunen, was a couple of weeks ago when the AI Omnibus text was agreed that, I quote, "Our businesses and citizens want two things from AI rules. They want to be able to innovate and feel safe. Safety, however, does not equal respect for human rights." And finally, obvious recent geopolitical developments have enabled a more explicit link to be drawn between digital sovereignty, tech, and security. Once again, in the words of Hanna Virkkunen, an increased defense budget is good news for our critical technologies like quantum or AI, because the defense industry and critical technologies very much go hand in hand. So to conclude, I think through all the different pathways to digital sovereignty, and I think we will hear more from our speakers about different visions beyond EU policy, we need to recenter on what we actually want to achieve and protect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Plixavra. So our next speaker is Susanna.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Thank you, Plixavra, for setting the stage. That's very good, because I don't have to do it. So I want to zoom in on two of the questions that are listed in the panel description. But before I do that, I just want to talk about a couple of concepts that help me make sense of this space right now. And the first one comes from a paper that was published already 2 years ago. So when the whole debate was beginning to take shape, that's a paper from Timo Seidel. Its title is "Moving On, Not to Fall Behind." And there he, with his co-author, basically look at EU policy and how the idea of sovereignty has been used earlier, strategic autonomy, and they conclude that the ambiguity of that term is actually a feature, not a bug, and in a sense that because it's ambiguous, for some people doing other, for not lawyers, they could call it like an boundary object, right? It allows to gather a big crowd around something that is pretty vague, but we all have some sort of an idea of what it could mean. So in more policy talk, it's an intermediate policy. It allows to gather under one banner many groups who actually want different things and then move forward. So I think we are at this point where this ambiguity is reaching its limits, and we finally need to decide what kind of future we actually want. And we see how it's being unfolded in the EU policy, what you described, this sacrificing of certain priorities in the name of other. I think is an example of that. This is not to say that trade-offs are out of the question. Every kind of decision, every kind of political decision consists of trade-offs. So I think we should be honest about these trade-offs, and instead of pretending that we can have everything. So once we have more clarity and honesty on this, I think we can then move forward in terms of what kind of steps we want to implement. And there's several options on the table right now. One of them is the EuroStack proposition, which also has different flavors depending on who you ask. The other is more pushing for open source, for digital commons. They're not contradictory. For example, the EuroStack Industrial Initiative also promotes open source as a way of promoting, as a way of strengthening European companies. But if you look beyond the slogans, you see also again like the different goals that these pathways assume. And for EuroStack, it's basically all about productivity and growth. This is the way the problem is being identified, that the reason why Europe is where it is right now is beyond of the decrease in our productivity and the decrease in growth. And unless this is tackled, we will not get out of this being what they call like a digital colony, right? Unless there's money in Europe to be invested in European companies, we will not get out of this vicious circle of just paying rents that are then invested somewhere else. But this is one way of looking at it. The digital commons starts from a different premise, and it kind of wants to leverage this opening that we're currently experiencing, this shock that we're currently experiencing, not only to move the companies or the productivity to Europe, but also to sort of redesign the digital ecosystem. And it's based on this, I think, kind of shared diagnosis that, well, the promises of the internet didn't really deliver, and maybe right now, once the disillusionment is shared among people, more and more people are unhappy with how their online experience looks like. Many people, despite increasing uses of AI, are saying that they hate AI. So maybe now is the time to intervene and envision something different. This can be done by European companies, but it doesn't have to be done by European companies, because again, like the fact that a company has its headquarters in Europe doesn't necessarily mean that it's gonna implement a different business model, and ultimately it often boils down to both business models and then investment models that are behind these business models. So this was just to maybe zoom in on some of those options that are out there on the table right now. Another concept, and I think this is also useful to make sense of the space, is something that's called like sovereignty paradox. That can be called sovereignty paradox, and it basically is the idea that a lot of this sovereignty that we're currently talking about is built still on the infrastructure owned by someone else. So I think the mention of the gigafactories and AI factories is a good example of that. So we're on the one hand, and it is a bit of a double bind, because on the one hand there's this push for building European infrastructure in Europe, but at the same time we simply don't have the components to do it in a way that does not then feed the profits again to someone else. So we have to do many things at the same time, which is not easy. And I think to close up, there's this idea. Again, from a recent paper, of the state capacity for strategic identification, and it comes up in a context of the quite I guess jargony idea of important projects of common European interest. For those of you who follow EU's industrial policy, this might be a bit more familiar, but it's basically a way to structure state aid in a way that's legal under the treaties. And there's this different important projects of common European interest popping up, where businesses come together from different member states and they negotiate with the Commission that they should be allowed to get state aid because it's of strategic importance. So I think this is a good way to look at what the EU is actually prioritizing. And we still don't have, for example, an AI important project of common European interest. So I think this strategic capacity of states to identify what actually matters is where we can sort of call the bluff of the EU and have evidence of what we're actually prioritizing. So I would encourage us to look beyond the slogans, which are, as I said, in my opinion, often vague by design, and see where the money goes, see where the companies are coming together when they're talking to the Commission and actually building these structures that then can translate into infrastructural investments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I just ask you one clarification question? The concept that you mentioned in the end from the paper, in the end, like on the strategic capacity?
It's state capacity for strategic identification.
State capacity for strategic identification.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you so much. We'll go to our third speaker, Alexandra Pol from Pascal.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you for...
Maybe just put it a bit closer.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me today. So before I start, just to tell you a bit about Pascal, because this is important, this context for what I'm going to tell you about our views on digital sovereignty afterwards. So Pascal is actually a spin-off from l'Institut d'Optique in France. It's a company that was created in 2019 to build quantum computers. So to already respond of what we heard already before, we already have actually 5 quantum computers in operation across the world, that they're operational and usable. In Europe, in North America, and in Asia as well. We have been funded by a Nobel Prize from 2022 of physics, Alain Aspect. So we are really grounded in actually scientific research to do that. And we also actually build what we call the application on top that will allow notably to solve a complex optimization and simulation problem and add value to the society, for instance, for the development and discovery of new material or drug discovery. We have been involved in the dialogue on digital sovereignty, and I would like to rather speak about resilience instead of digital sovereignty, and I will come back to that as well. In this debate for already several years, and we actually, as a private company, do take part of this effort at European but also at global level. One of the questions we had for the preparation of this panel was to also have a bit of a landscape about where we are at with digital sovereignty. So what is interesting to see, at least at European level in the context, was that first, with the first von der Leyen Commission mandate, we started to plant the seeds of what we could call digital sovereignty, notably by looking rather at what we call investment programs. So you might have seen that. It has been mentioned, for instance, IPCIs has been created in different domains, in microelectronics, in cloud, in batteries, across Europe, to try to see how we could build some sort of resilience in Europe in this type of capacities. We have also actually been looking at strategies that were non-legally binding, such as the industrial strategy that has been revisited twice with former Commissioner Breton for different digital capabilities, again from cloud, software, semiconductor, for instance, that were put aside. And we also have tried to start to develop indeed some of these mechanism or structure or governance that could plant the seed for, I would go now to that then, to the deployment of digital sovereignty across Europe. And this was, for example, the European Digital Infrastructure Consortium that was mentioned on EDIC for the Digital Commons, or even for EuroStack. So this was phase 1, let's say, of Commission von der Leyen. Phase 2 now is really, as you see, a shift to try to firm up this strategy from non-legally binding instrument, much more boosted in industrial and financial instrument, to more legally binding approach to digital sovereignty. So you had the emergence now indeed of what you might have heard in few weeks now that will be developed of CAIDA, notably the Cloud and the AI Act that will be issued on that vein. You will have the review in that same sovereignty technological package of the CHIP Act, the second version, to deploy semiconductor and increase the market share of Europe in this type of technology that will be also put in place. You also have now all the narrative and all the development of trying to map and mind the gap on our critical dependency on key strategic technologies. You also have the issue of the Raw Material Act, and I could move again on and on how we are trying to build there. The issue now is really how we really make sense of this shift from industry and financial instrument to a legal definition of what is digital sovereignty. If we already agree on what we mean there, this is also something to really challenge, to really how we are going to go from a concept to really an implementation and a delivery of what does it mean. So when I look at that from a company prospect and really a private company prospect, for me, it's not so much digital sovereignty what it could be. So what it could be and also is what's the purpose of that? Is the purpose of digital sovereignty to actually rebuild the full entirety of our component infrastructure within Europe? That's the first question. Do we really have, if that's the case, the capacity to really rebuild everything made in Europe for each technology at 100% in Europe? Is the purpose instead to try to being more protectionist towards our market and try to make the European market flourish at the expense of the global market? Or is it something else? And I think it's something else. The something else for us, when we look at that in practice, is really to say, is the capacity for us to act in an autonomous way with choice and independency. So when I build a computer in the company, when we do that at Pascal, we have several different components. And many of them, we try to source the majority of them in Europe. Some, we cannot still do that. So what's the alternative that we have? And there is where we have no more choice. And it's when we create choice at the end that we are going to bring back this resilience, and that's why I like to say that in the capacity of producing these technical capabilities, and not only to say that we are going to be sovereign. And to do that, sometimes we also need to partner, and that's very important that this is understood. The reality today is that we also need to have some external partnership in some key critical component that today we are not able, and we might never be able to reproduce at 100% within Europe only. So what is not about digital sovereignty is not about protectionism of isolation in practice. And the second thing is also about choice for not only for the producer when I build the computer, but also for the end user. The end user wants to have choice. So for him, it's not just Pascal build quantum computer full stack from the hardware to the application level alone, and is the only value proposition I can actually provide in Europe, but he also have alternatives from other providers based on other technological bases. And I think this is where you start to bring choice, you start to bring resilience, you start to bring autonomy for your markets, and actually where at the end you can have this sort of digital sovereignty, not in paper, but really in practice. What I have seen as challenge here now is really that. So compared to other parts of the world, I am just back from Canada, they are starting to actually put in place some if I would say, digital sovereignty strategies. In the sense, their strategy in Canada, if I give you the example, is build in Canada if you can. If not, buy from like-minded states, like Europe. And if you can still not do it, or if you have to do that, do it with partners. And today, I think we are getting first to the legal implication now at this stage of developing so many different acts without thinking at the real implementation consequences that it means in terms of resilience or digital sovereignty in Europe. So the real question now, the challenge is, what is our strategy and how we are sure that we are going to deliver it in practice? And this today without being in isolation and with providing choice for both the providers but also for the end users. And I think this is really the moment where we are now in Europe, and that we might also want to learn from the past of what was not working so well in Europe. For example, in the cloud market, where we have seen, of course, major vendor locking in Europe until now that we have a public procurement that has been awarded for a sovereign cloud, but also that we can learn from others what they are doing and how they are going to see that. If I take the field where I am working at today, so again on quantum, we are going to have a Quantum Act. You might have heard about this. We had the quantum strategy issue in last July that was really looking at basically what will be our strategy, what will we are going to have kind of a like-minded or international partnership strategy to build this resilience in quantum in Europe. And this is a bit the path we should take, but so far there is not something that we see. From the lesson learned, for example, from the cloud market, there is something that is really, I think, important to see as a parallel with quantum computing, is that the hardware that we build is really where our resilience lies on. I can build as many applications I want on top. If I don't master and have some autonomy in the infrastructure layer, then the application could be developed by anyone else. And this was happening in the cloud. We had many data centers in Europe that were not made by European players. Europe has been focalizing to say, oh, we are going to develop only the application on top to provide this user experience. But however, we have been locked in that market. So I think when we look at this strategy for Europe in terms of digital sovereignty or resilience, we also need to think about this in a bit of I would say, a full stack or technological brick that we really want and really aim to develop, the one where we put the mean for that, and the one where we have to really have a wake-up call that we will not be able to build that, and we really need to have a strong partnership. And that's with what I will conclude for the discussion today. I look forward for your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alexander. Could you pass on the mic to our final speaker? Our final speaker, Thomas Streins.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Joris and Plixafra, for putting this panel on the CPDP program, and thanks everyone for being here. I might suffer from confirmation bias, but I think it's the most important topic to address. And what I thought I'd do is to work through Joris's 4 questions. What is being imagined? What should we imagine? What do we need to do? And what are the challenges? And I'll try to give very clear answers to each of these 4, in also the spirit of launching us into a discussion, both on the panel, but hopefully also with all of you. So what is being imagined? My answer is not enough. So just a question to also wake you up on this Wednesday morning. Who of you has read the Declaration on Digital Sovereignty that was issued by European member states last November in Berlin? Who has read it? Okay. So the ones that are being paid to read it, because it's part of their job. And I don't blame anyone who has not read it, because I don't think it's the kind of declaration that will go down in history like the Declaration of Independence that the United States issued in 1776. It lacks imagination. It's not geared towards a public. It's not a document that is meant to be read by a public. It's a technical document that has a definition of digital sovereignty, that has the right ideas about increasing independence, being able to make your own choices. It's about agency in that way, and it's about European values. But it doesn't spell out what that actually means for Europe. It doesn't spell out what it actually means for Europeans. And that's also why I think it's not credible. No one really believes that this declaration will become reality. I have a similar feeling when I look at other materializations of the digital sovereignty discourse. If we try to find digital sovereignty in the real world, we, as lawyers, we might be trained to try to find a definition in a legislative instrument, or to try to associate legislative proposals like the Cloud and AI Development Act with the digital sovereignty agenda. But there too, I would argue, it's not enough. It's too narrow an imagination of what digital sovereignty might mean. And I would the same thing about the EuroStack initiative. Now, I have a lot of sympathy for that initiative. I do think it asks the right question. What kind of digital infrastructure should we build in Europe to achieve digital sovereignty? But I don't think it gives the right answers to that question. And I think it's again because it lacks imagination. Because the imagination, at least for one prominent strand of the EuroStack initiative, seems to be that we need to build the kind of digital infrastructure that is being built elsewhere in Europe. So the imagination is European AI that looks exactly like the kind of AI that is being built and developed in Silicon Valley and Shenzhen, but in Europe. It's European social media that looks exactly like the social media companies that have dominated the online ecosystem for the last 2 decades, but owned by European companies, headquartered in Europe, which, as was pointed out, is already the case. And I think that's not enough. So what should we imagine? Second question, actual alternatives. There are different kinds of AI. There are different kinds of social media. There are new technologies, like quantum technologies, and those enable alternative pathways. So if you think about social media, I find it so striking how we are kind of stuck in the paradigms that have been with us now for 2 decades plus, when the amazing thing about the internet that some now try to recapture is that it's a human creation. It's built. So we can also build it differently, towards different ends. And that's why I think this means-ends question that was posed by Plixavra is really important. So digital sovereignty is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. And those ends are ultimately, I would argue, about us. How we live, how we vote, how we make money, how we meet our partners. All of these activities are intermediated through digital infrastructures. So it matters what these digital infrastructures look like. So what we should do is imagine how we are going to live, how we want to live in 2030, which is a normative question, to then build the digital infrastructures that allow us to live the way we want to live. That's what I think we should dare to imagine. So what do we need to do that? I think we need conditions to have that kind of discourse, and I'm struck why we don't have it. And I think it's partly because our institutions are not built for this particular moment. So I'm working on a paper that's called Not Built to Build, because the EU is not built as an organization that builds digital infrastructures. It's also seems to have lost its ability to conjure an imagination of what the future of Europe looks like. And in some ways, it's about going back to what is European integration for, which is another means-ends question. So what we, I think, need to do is to reimagine the kinds of institutions that allow us to decide on the normative orientation of the European project, to then build the kinds of infrastructures that get us there, which will require us to revisit the regulatory instruments that enable different kinds of infrastructure building and might block other ones. And to me, that's a regulatory paradigm shift. So instead of trying to address the externalities that current digital infrastructures impose, whether they are environmental, whether it's psychological harm, it's about creating the conditions through regulation that allow us to build different infrastructures. Now, this is an endeavor that some might call unrealistic. It's also an endeavor that's really risky. So we might get it wrong. We might waste a lot of money. We might make dumb choices and might lock us into infrastructural path dependencies that are not necessarily better than the ones we are currently in. But I would argue it's still worth doing. We just need to do it smartly. We need to experiment with alternative pathways. So we could have, as the EuroStack initiative imagines, competitions about alternative AI infrastructures, alternative social media infrastructures. And in that way, we might be able to also reinvigorate our democracies, ultimately, which seem to have lost that imagination that the European public can decide its own destiny. Which brings me to the final question, what are the challenges? So the challenges that I already highlight, we might need new institutions. The other big challenge is, of course, the geopolitical one. So if this project managed to be successful, it will endanger a lot of pushback. And I think one thing that gives me optimism in the current political moment is the sense that we may have been too naive in the general internet governance community, but also in the regulatory community within the European Union. Too naive about the winners and losers of the digital transformation, too naive about the success of our regulatory instruments. So if we manage to get more realistic about that, we might be able to make progress with building the kinds of digital infrastructures that we want. But if we are, that will create pushback. I had one of the best discussions that I've ever had on digital sovereignty with colleagues in Canada, who in some ways are more advanced in the discourse and also more advanced in the building, it seems to me. And that was the first question they asked me. How can we do this? How can we achieve the kind of digital sovereignty we want, build the kind of digital infrastructure we want without angering our southern neighbor too much? And I think that's a very fair and very important question. I think it's in the same vein of not being naive, important to be realistic about the economic pushback and the political pushback that such a project entails. But I think there too, we can be smart about it. So one way of being smart about it is to lean into the innovation narrative, kind of recapture the innovation discourse, say, this is not anti-American. This is just about innovation. We're trying to build new infrastructures towards different ends. So that's on the narrative level. The other is that we need, and that ties to the institution challenge, we need institutions that are actually able to protect the space in which Europe might be able to innovate differently. And I'm afraid to say that currently there seems to be a lack of political will, both at the national and at the European level, to do that. And I'll close by saying that I find this question so important because I do think it is existential. And it's not just existential in terms of how we're going to live, but it's also existential for our mode of governance. When I taught the Law of the Stack seminar at the UI, which was a lot about the law and governance dimension of the stack, Anna Pisakiewicz from our Center of Digital Society at the end asked whether it's possible. Because she had just read Brecon Act, which is an account of how China engineered its transformation over the last 2 decades. And China, of course, has the advantage of being an authoritarian system where it's easier to set one direction and to follow through on it. But I think that's the challenge. We need to find a way to engage in a kind of European governance that is aligned with our values, but still allows us to build the kind of digital infrastructures that we need. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. So wow, that was quite a rich set of presentations so early on in the morning. We have about half an hour left for questions and discussions. I definitely have a lot of questions myself, but I'm going to look into the room to see if there are questions in the room, and I already see a few. So let's just go into the room. I propose that we'll pick a few questions each turn, and then turn to the panel for answering. So maybe 2 or 3 questions at once. I have a mic here, but I'm just wondering if someone may help to carry the mic into the audience. So maybe first the gentleman here on the sitting at the wall.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentations. My name is Mark Scott from the Atlantic Council's Democracy and Tech Initiative. I have a lot of sympathy for everything you've said, and a lot of frustration that goes on within the Commission and their perpetual proposals and regulation. I would love to get your thoughts on some basic things that still haven't happened with the digital signal market, despite 20 years of it happening. Looking at the reconstruction of the capital markets, the labor markets, to sort of create a more coherent structure to provide the infrastructure that Thomas suggested at the end. It feels like we're building the fancy bits with the CHIPS Act and the Cloud Act, et cetera, without fixing the basic structure of how that would actually work to provide a digital sovereignty that is functional and economic rather than pie in the sky and creating another Quero, if anyone remembers the Franco-German Google. So I just want to get your thoughts about why you think it's so difficult, other than the national pushback against anything like that, why the EU/Commission have been unwilling to sort of do the basics rather than looking at the fancy stuff. Thank you.
Maybe the other question here from the front on the side.
Wojciech Wiewiórowski, I'm the European Data Protection Supervisor. First of all, thanks for Alexandra Paul for her, let's say, definition of what the sovereignty may mean. That goes quite close to the things which we try to deal with, dealing with the Microsoft, use of Microsoft software by the European Commission. But my question is actually to the last speaker. You asked about the fundamental questions on what the institutions are for and what are we preparing the European project for. Aren't you afraid that you are asking too much and the answer may not be necessarily the one that you expect, and the people may think that sovereignty shall be built on the lower level than the level of the whole continent.
Thank you so much. Maybe the question there, the back of the woman with the striped shirt. Oh, maybe the woman with the striped shirt in the back. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the order of the hands.
I just don't want to.
Hello, my name is Tessa. I'm actually working at a province, and I had a very direct question for Alexandra. I think you mentioned that hardware is the real resilience of our sovereignty, like will bring us real resilience, and we are dealing with, of course, data centers that are popping up very fast, and we don't really have regulation to like sort of really give it, to really regulate it and keep it in control, or to make it accessible to the companies that we would prefer, because we just really do not have the legislation for that. So maybe you have some tips for us, like how could we, what could we maybe with our means as a province do to regulate that?
Great. So let's take it here, and then we'll do another round. Of course, I can see many answers. We'll get to you. But so who wants to start?
Okay, so thanks a lot for your question. So indeed, in terms of data center, is a very interesting question. So this was, I would say, my previous life before Pascal. I spent 6 years as a chief economist in the European Commission, in the cloud and software unit in particular. So we have been actually working on that, in the remit of what happened with the US Cloud Act that you might know, and some of the extraterritoriality of the law there. And where we have realized at that stage, that actually more than 80% of the data from Europeans were stored in infrastructure in Europe, but owned by non-European providers. Let's put it like this. So we know that was a challenge. With the data, so the idea, that's why I'm also saying that the infrastructure is part of, of the sovereignty and of the resilience of a continent for that reason, based on that experience. On your specific question, I saw something that happened in France in particular at that time. That was really, they developed kind of very, if I can say, a dynamic or aggressive data center strategy to really become one of the hubs in Europe of building data centers, and in Europe and so in France, to also attract jobs. What happened from that strategy? There is two things that I would like to still put some, if I can say, not warning, but some consideration there. Is one, of course, data centers are very energy, consume a lot of energy, so we need to also have this trade-off when we look at building a strategy around data center across long jobs, if I can say. And the second as well is the type of solution that were emerging in that context. So there is a solution in France that is called Blue, that was basically a partnership between Orange, Capgemini, and also Microsoft to build basically cloud offers for the public sector there. And the idea was to say, because we don't have the know-how in France to really build and operate and maintain this data center, the deal was Microsoft will do that, and Orange and Capgemini will build on top again the software and the services on cloud. So that was, of course, that's what I'm saying, a consideration to have in mind. Again, the debate of today, if there we really achieve resilience when we develop this type of model. So we have this trade-off to, as I was saying, to partner where we are not able to do it, and at the same time to make sure that we remain independent and we can provide choice without having a vendor locking issue. So today we will have this CAIDA. So that's exactly, so the CAIDA is the Cloud and AI Act that will be released as part of this technological sovereignty package in a few days or weeks that is announced at European level. And one exact purpose there would be to try also via the cloud to address this question of locking, know-how transfer, and I guess energy efficiency as well will be tackled there, to see how we can build this data center brick that is also actually important for AI in a way that can promote the resilience of Europe. So my take on your question, you will have some, I think, regulation coming to guide you at European level for the local, national level. But I will also a bit concur with the gentleman here up front that has raised that question as well, that sovereignty or resilience doesn't happen only at federal or EU level, it happens as well at local level, and it will also be built, on a partnership, I think, with the providers as well. Because what I was saying before is sovereignty is not about only putting the market condition around to protect users, it's also about building this sovereign infrastructure or this resilient infrastructure. And this is not in the hand of the regulator, it's the market doing that. They are the providers. And actually, when you start by first trying to regulate a concept or, like sovereignty or resilience, or even regulate a data center without understanding the necessity to build them, but also the impact on the end user is more challenging. So I think on your question, the most important point, if you were to look at what to do next, is I remember in my courses of economics, of welfare economics, was you have public intervention when the market fails. So in the sense that, or where you have an issue in the market that cannot be solved to protect your users. So here the main risk in this data strategy, if I can say center strategy, or if you were to put a regulation that I would see, is really this locking effect that would make that end users will have no choice. So we had another, regulation at European level that this one was passed that was called free flow of non-personal data, and that even if the name says that, it was really about how you switch from one provider to another one, cloud provider, and how you can move your data from one data center to another one. So this can already give you some indication in terms of how you protect your end users and you make sure that they can change cloud services, and therefore also, so if we can say data center provider there, in a sense. But it will not respond to the second question is, do you want to do from this also, a more attractiveness strategy for your region or for your provinces? And if that's the case, then maybe the regulatory tool might not be, your first need, your first instrument to make this happen. It might be more, a partnership, an ecosystem with provider as well, with some end user to test something at the provincial level. As we saw in the past, this AI sandbox, so trying to actually operate with the current framework without having to regulate to see really if there is a danger to do that. Because we need to avoid also the other tendency to try to over-regulate before a technology is really in the market, what is the case for data center, that's not a problem. But you need to really see for what you need that regulation. Do you have an issue that the market can solve, or can you do it provincially, with some partnership or innovation with the ecosystem? So okay. I hope I give you some idea, and watch out what will happen with this CAIDA that will be issued very soon from the Commission.
Which was just actually yesterday, there was an announcement that it's been delayed for the second time, and the date that has been put is the 3rd of June. It would be coming out, the Cloud and AI Development Act. Thomas, do you want to say something about the second question still? And maybe we can keep the answers a little bit shorter. That's okay. It was very rich answer and very interesting, but also because there are quite a few questions in the room. So maybe we pick up on the other two questions a little bit more shortly and then move to the room again.
I'll do my best. Thanks a lot for your question, which was basically, aren't you asking too much of European institutions? And my short answer would be probably yes, especially given the current state. But I think I take your caveats very seriously. So I'm not saying that we should build European institutions that can build the kind of digital infrastructure for us. What I would expect of European institutions is to organize the political discourse in a way that allows us to imagine differently, and I don't see them doing that enough. And I would expect European institutions to do the basics, to create the conditions under which we can build digital infrastructures indeed from the bottom up. I think it has to be from the bottom up. That's where creativity resides, that's where local knowledge resides, that's where a lot of innovation resides, and I think it's important to activate that. And the other dimension that you also highlighted in your intervention is to do it transnationally. So build with Canada, build with Japan, build with Korea, build with Australia. I mean, there are other countries that have the same discourse. We don't need to do it alone in Europe, and I think that's another role that European institutions can play very productively. Your question, I think, is a really rich one. I think there's a political economy answer to that. It's a lot about the inner logics of the European institutions as they exist today. I think also a lot of frustration with the difficulty of achieving the single market in general and the digital single market in particular. But I do think that there's also a conceptual problem with the very concept of the digital single market. I don't think we really know what it is and what it means. And that's a problem if we treat it as an end that we are working towards, because I do think that the digital markets operate differently because of the different role that digital infrastructures play, which might then also necessitate a different regulatory approach that is not just geared towards harmonization, mutual recognition, and convergence, but towards digital infrastructure building. But I'd be happy to follow up with that.
Great, thank you so much. Susanna, you want to say something about any of the questions? No?
No, maybe just briefly about the institutions, making a link between aren't we putting too much faith in the institutions, and then why aren't the institutions doing the basics? It just, for me, it just makes me question the good faith of the institution. But this takes us a path that we probably don't want to go. But when we see at the actions that some of the institutions are taking after the Draghi report, which pointed into different directions, right? It didn't only talk about simplification or deregulation. The points you made were also included there. But when we see the enthusiasm that the institutions engage with, like the deregulation agenda, instead of focusing on what we actually need to have this innovation, to have this entrepreneurial spirit in Europe thriving, it just makes me, as I said, question their good faith.
Thank you.
And maybe a small comment on the data centers. I think this goes back to the issue of Susanna regarding trade-offs. If we want data to be stored in Europe, that requires data centers. So that will come with the environmental impact that entails. So there we have to be honest about those type of trade-offs.
Thanks so much. So we do another round of questions. First, maybe the gentleman there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was really a fascinating panel. I'm Guy Banim. I work with an organization called Build Up, and we work with peace builders around the world. And so much of what you said has been really helpful to me to try and articulate back to the people we work with, which are in Sudan and Yemen and Somalia and Myanmar and so on. So this insight that we know that tech has negative externalities. We know that we not want to build a tech which delivers the human goals that we want to achieve. We have a panel on this tomorrow to discuss much more. But I'm really curious, like, what would you say in terms of, like, I mean, the EU institutions are funding us to do some of this work. So that's I think that's good that there are people in the institutions like, yes, we need to fund this kind of tech. Of course, it's peanuts in the global scale of things. And so we're talking about re-engineering social media platforms. Now we're talking about re-engineering AI to deliver the human value that we need. But then we brand it as digital sovereignty. And I have a lot of difficulty with my colleagues who are not European, who are Nigerian or Indian. I think that, what do we say about this narrative? How do we build a narrative which meets that goal? And should we abandon the digital sovereignty tag for that purpose of building human-centered tech which delivers what we need in a war and peace setting?
Okay, thank you. Could you pass on the mic just to the person? No, the person in front has been waiting. Alexander? No.
Okay, thank you. Alexander Strel from the University of Namur. Thomas, just one concrete question. If you have to, what is the first step you will take to have your dream come true? And then another thing which is linked to that is, in a way, could you see the winning of the US big tech as the winning of a war on value which has never been waged, really, you know? So I think that's the problem. I mean, we had a war, but we didn't see it. And so I think we have to have in a very different mood if we want to fight back, you know.
There's one maybe the last question here in the front. Could you pick it? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marcel Kulaya, Access Now. Thomas, you said previously that there's a regulatory shift that is needed, and you described it as rather from tackling what has been imposed on us to basically create an environment in which we can innovate. I would like to ask whether it's not rather that we actually need both? And how do you see the existing digital regulations that already exist in that scheme? And how do you see this simplification, approach of the Commission to do it, which is, let's be fair, rather like a deregulation, what the Commission is doing, and whether that is needed as part of like building our environment for innovation, or whether it's not needed at all, and if it's a completely wrong direction according to your opinion.
Who would like to pick up on some of the questions first?
Maybe I can.
Susanna, please go ahead. Yeah.
Maybe on the sovereignty tag. I think I'm afraid that ship has sailed. We have a commissioner for sovereignty, so I think it's here to stay. But as I try to explain in my intervention, I think this is malleable enough to contain many different meanings and goals. And I myself am not a fan of this particular tag, but I'm also kind of a bit fed up with the discussions about like, what does it actually mean? I mean, it can mean anything basically, right? Not anything, of course, I'm exaggerating, but yeah, let's try to hijack it. And I think we can find enough proof and evidence that it's not about decoupling, that it's not about Europe on its own, that it is about partnership with like-minded people. We can talk about, instead of sovereignty, we can say that it's actually about self-determination at different levels, right? At the level of individual organization and the state and the continent. And I think in that sense, we can sort of diffuse the how loaded that tag is. But I would probably not waste time on trying to get rid of it.
Okay, thanks. Plixavra?
Yeah, I had a very similar answer to the same question. I think that I also struggled a lot with this term. Do we need it? Do we not need it? There have been also a lot of iterations. So for example, in indigenous traditions, indigenous data sovereignty is about self-determination and reclaiming control. So inspiration can be drawn to turn this term. And also at the same time, human-centric. One can say that human-centric is also very vague. Human-centric AI can also be self-contradictory. So I think the terms, we can debate a lot about them, but that's why I also wanted to emphasize that ultimately it's a means. So then it's about what we want to achieve and how can we make that work rather than debating what does it really, what's the full definition.
Thank you. Thomas, do you want to speak to one of the questions?
Yeah, happy to, and also happy to follow up afterwards. So I have a lot of sympathy for alternative narratives, but I agree with Susanna that the term is too potent in the current moment, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about alternative ways of filling it with life. So Alex is very challenged with this question, what's the first step? So I have two answers to that. So one, for myself, what I try to do as an academic is to engage in discussions such as this one, but also at the UI to build a space where we can imagine alternative digital infrastructures in cooperation with other academic partners, but also with social society and those actors that actually build the alternatives. I mean, they are there. The question is, what are they good at? What are they not good at? How could they scale up? So what are the political, economic, legal conditions under which alternative digital infrastructures, and by extension, alternative digital futures, can come to fruition? I think there's an exciting research agenda, but I think it's also a really important political project. And that's the second answer I would give. So if I was Ursula von der Leyen, what I think I would be most worried about is that the institution has lost credibility and legitimacy to lead that discourse. And so what the first thing I would try to do is to try to regain that. And I think that would need to start with a much more honest and realistic assessment of where we are and much more creativity as to where we might want to be going. And I think that's where your second point on values connects with something Alexander was saying and where I will politely disagree with you. And it's about what's the role of regulation here. Is regulation just about market failures and externalities, or is regulation ultimately about values? And I would argue it's the latter. So the right kind of regulation allows us to specify where we want to go, how we want to live. And that's connecting to your question, where we can and of course should build on existing regulation. So some regulations have announced important ideas that continue to be important if we shift from regulation to building. So data protection by design, I think, is the right idea. It's just not the case that one article in GDPR brings it into reality. So what we need to do is to figure out how to make it a reality, and if we shift towards building, that actually might be an opportunity. I think the other thing that we can build on is on the ecosystems that have developed around existing regulation, sometimes by design, as with the DSA, sometimes through historical path dependencies, as in data protection. Unfortunately, that's not what the Commission seems to be thinking. So I'm very critical of the simplification agenda for the reason that you highlight, which is not to say that simplification is always bad or that even deregulation is always bad. But the agenda that is currently being pursued seems to lock in the current innovation paradigm and seems to be laser focused on reducing compliance costs. And I think that's not in the interest of Europe, and it's also not in the interest of the European Commission, which is why I find it so puzzling.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask a last question to the whole panel to wrap this up. Maybe we can take it in the opposite order that we started with. So the question I have is one about the concept or like the reality of dependence. And maybe, also to reframe that right away, interdependence. And maybe I would also refer to the work of Jennifer Cobbe and others who have stressed that this talk about dependence is not really good. It's much better to think about interdependence because that's a reality and it's inescapable. And in many ways, we are talking about the ways in which we deal with interdependence. In new kind of digitally mediated, societies and reality. And so clearly one direction you can take on the interdependence is one of weaponizing it. And that's very dominant in international relations discourse. We have the concept of weaponized interdependence, and it's quite influential. Actually, it's quite influential in forming also national strategies. The QDNL strategy, the Dutch strategy in relation to quantum technologies, for instance, is one of wanting to build the new ASML of the quantum future. And the ASML, of course, the chip machine company that is one of or maybe the most valued company in Europe. That is the goal of the Netherlands, and it's not the goal of the Netherlands to build together with Europe, one of those, what is called a choke point. No, they wanted to do it themselves. And I think in many ways, what is happening in Europe is that we have, that build agenda that is actually playing out in many ways at the national level with very aggressive kind of, visions of how to deal with interdependence. And everybody just wants to come out ahead in a very techno-nationalist kind of idea. So, and this also shows where Europe is kind of, how is Europe even positioned there? And what can Europe do then also to manage that? Is it possible to do these things actually through European visions? And what are the ways in which we can maybe look at interdependence more constructively towards the future? So that's my final question. And maybe, Thomas, you can start and then we'll go this direction. And we have to keep it fairly short. It's basically you have 1 minute per
Yeah,
speaker.
Thanks a lot. I think it's an excellent question, and I agree with Jennifer Cobbe on the importance of interdependence and to think through in which cases interdependence is desired, in which case it is not. So we can look at that from security perspectives, from geopolitical dependence perspectives, but also in terms of economic distribution perspectives. And what I would encourage, in line with everything what I've been trying to say, is to facilitate competition. So I don't think we need the European solution at the European level, but so we should facilitate competition. It's not a bad thing that different EU member states try to experiment with different solutions, but there's a need for some degree of interoperability as a particular kind of interdependence, and there's a need for much more information sharing between the different actors that pursue different agendas.
Thank you. Alexandra.
Yes. So you mentioned the quantum. So on quantum, we have, as I was saying, the Quantum Act. One of the ideas is to have more coordination between the different member states. If I take back again the example of France, we have already 5 competing startups that they are already doing well and providing quantum services or computers across Europe. And so I think that's one of the things we also need to think is where they are coming from. And they all have something in common, that were the scientific roots first. So it was not about a made construction by a national state or European state where they're coming from. They are coming from the scientific and from the markets. So I think that's also to have in mind, and that at European level, the coordination to at least align the effort, because that's also a point, is important. But market forces will remain market forces to provide some users. And I think we shouldn't confuse, the ability and the role of each actors in the society. The one that they are there to develop laws, and sometimes it's not laws, regulation, it can be strategies, and the one, again, that they are providing and building some services. And just to comment back, I don't think we are on the simplification agenda at all on digital sovereignty. As I said at the beginning, we are on the contrary, on the multiplication of proliferation of CADA, CHIP Acts, Raw Material Act, and other coming up on digital sovereignty.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Yeah, very briefly. So for me, this idea of this weaponized interdependence, and the fact that not maybe the idea, but the fact that it became so popular is a symptom of this sort of shift in our political discourse. And this kind of recognition that we've been so naive, now we have to be pragmatic. And I think right now the pendulum is shifting somewhat in the other direction. And I think we are losing a lot of what we are actually good at as Europe because of this. So I think for me the point is to, not to sacrifice what we're good at in the name of FOMO or in the name of being pragmatic right now. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and a very last point between me and the coffee is that I think interdependence is a lot also about the power dynamics. Within Europe, we're also not all equally powerful. So I think it's also a matter of building alliances when we have less strength amongst the smaller states to then be able to compete with the bigger states and then grow from there.
Thank you so much. And please join me in a round of applause for a great panel.